All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Gillikin. I'm one of the co-chairs of Livable Seville. Thank you so much for joining us. Livable Seville advocates for policies to build an inclusive Charlottesville area with affordable housing, sustainable transportation, and healthy neighborhoods welcoming for all. And now that the zoning code has been passed, we as a group are starting to try to think about some other issues, particularly transportation. And, I think that Charlottesville's transportation system leaves some things to be desired, to say the least. Our buses don't run as frequently as they should. Our sidewalks are not as complete as they should be. And if you're a cyclist, you often feel like you're at risk. So we can talk about why that is. I think we'll hear a little bit about that, but we're here to learn from Veronica Davis, who wrote this really amazing book, Inclusive Transportation. I'm going to put a link to a deal to buy this in the chat in a minute. She has a great quote at the book that says, "Show me a transportation network and I will tell you the values of the decision makers who designed it." So what does Charlottesville's transportation system say about what we value as a community? And I think that's something we want to think about a little more deeply and think about what we can be doing better as we look to have a transportation system that is more inclusive and enables more people to get out and about through our city. So our main speaker today is Veronica Davis. She asked me to keep her bio short. She recently finished with a role in the City of Houston. She is an author and transportation nerd, and she has a number of Virginia connections. She was born in Alexandria, and she also has family in Fluvanna County, and there is a group of friends and family, I think, that might be logged in here. If they want to throw any questions in the chat, I can throw some zingers at her maybe. And our other speaker is Ben Chambers. He's the transportation manager for the City of Charlottesville. So he's going to give us some local updates on what's going on. The way this will work in terms of Q&A, we'll have a Q&A time at the end. The chat is set up that you can throw questions mainly to me. If anything comes up that you're wondering about, I'll hop in and let Veronica or Ben answer any questions. And then again, we'll have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end. So Veronica, I'll send it to you.
Thank you, and good evening. Thank you for having me, Matthew. I know we have been back and forth working on this. So I think my screen is up. So I want to say this to everybody watching. I don't know what's going on with ERCOT, which is the power grid in Texas, but my power has been fading up and down all day. So I hope I'm prayerful that we can get through today's talk. But as mentioned, inclusive transportation, my personal website is veronicao.com. And while Twitter and X are still doing their thing, I am Veronica O. Davis. So a little bit more about me. So I was born in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I was born in Alexandria, grew up in Springfield, Virginia. But when I was 5 years old, I moved to a little itty bitty town called Maplewood, New Jersey. It was a really great place to grow up in terms of walkability. It's a suburban community outside of New York. So it was like children of the corn. Most of our parents, took the train into New York. So we were left to our own devices with just the teachers. But it really was a great place to grow up. And even as young as, 8, I remember walking to get ice cream by myself. Because it was very safe. I don't remember any bad crashes growing up. Not to say they didn't happen, but it was just everyone drove slowly and things were pretty safe. I am the co-founder of Black Women Bike, which is funny because I actually don't like biking. I'm not one of these people that can like put on spandex and then like just bike for 100 miles. I get no joy in that. If I am biking, I actually have a sticker on my bike that says, friends don't let friends wear spandex. So it's funny that I end up being one of the co-founders. But I will say what's been really great about Black Women Bike is the number of Black women we have been getting biking for fitness, for fun, for transportation. We started with 3 founders, and it has grown to almost 2,000 women, mostly in the DC region. And it's not a cycling club. It really is about advocacy. It's about education. So we have a lot of our women who are trained cycling instructors who are getting more women cycling. And what was really awesome is we trended very older. A lot of young retirees made up the bulk of the membership. And it's women who wanted to stay active, who were on fixed income and wanted to bike around DC versus having to drive everywhere. And so even though I'm no longer in DC, the organization is still thriving, and the leadership there is really doing some great things. As mentioned, I used to be the director of transportation and drainage for the city of Houston. Often with these jobs, I was not a political appointee, but I was an executive of the administration, and we had an administration change. And so with that, I am now sitting at home, but my team is still moving the things forward. But don't worry about me. I'm out here thriving. This is a picture of me during my little break, where I am outside getting sun. I'm taking in a lot of infrastructure. I'm hydrated. I'm doing well in this, I guess, sabbatical, if you will, between jobs. And so, again, I wrote this book, Inclusive Transportation, a manifesto for repairing divided communities. I know that Matthew's going to drop the link in the chat. And this is just an overview of the table of contents. The foreword is by Tamika Butler, who is a really good friend, and those in the transportation industry know her very well. The preface, where I talk a little bit about the process of writing, particularly in the middle of a pandemic, which is when I wrote the bulk of the book. Introduction, which I will talk about in my talk today. Transportation is personal. I'll also be talking about that today as part of the framework. And then there's the other things, and I will talk about a little bit chapter 4, power, influence, and the complexity of people. And I will end with the call of action. So I'm going to skip chapters 2, 3, and 5 today. So if you want to know what's in there, you're going to have to buy the book and you're going to have to read it. So why I do what I do. This is, for those of you that don't live and breathe transportation, this is a ghost bike. We generally put these off once a cyclist has been struck and killed. This ghost bike is actually a person that I know. They died on August 19th, David Solovish. And this is why I do what I do. In America, 44,000 people died on our roadways across this country. And the thing about traffic-related deaths, they are all preventable. Every single solitary traffic-related death is preventable. And this is the thing that drives me. It's that people are dying, for no reason. And this is a graph that looks at the leading cause of death in children age 1 to 19. So motor vehicle crashes has been number 1. The only thing that has surpassed it now is fire-related injuries, particularly with all the mass shootings that have been happening, particularly at schools. So it's not a pride thing to drop to number 2, because we have to address guns as well. But even just the fact that it is one of the leading causes of death in young people. And again, it is 100% preventable. And I say all of this because I am going to talk about a lot of concepts. I know people have tried to peg me as anti-car, and that is not the truth. To me, it is really about safety. Anytime you leave your home, you should be able to return to your home in the same piece that you left in. Unless, of course, you're getting a haircut, then that's different. But why are people dying? So I know for those of you, it's the Institute of Transportation Engineers. This is a graphic. And so what this graphic is showing is how speed is really the killer, if you will. So at 20 miles per hour, if a person is struck, 90% of the people will be able to walk away, maybe have to take an ambulance, but they will survive. 10% will not. Just even increasing that speed to 30 miles an hour drops your probability of survival to 60%. At 40 miles an hour, it drops it to 20%. So this is one of the critical issues. There have been a bunch of us in the industry that have been advocating for lowering speed limits, but not just changing the sign, actually changing the infrastructure to slow people down. Because we do know that if people drive slower, there is a higher rate of survival for pedestrians who may be struck. However, there's also another school of thought that says this data is outdated. And part of the reason, this was prepared by a publication that shows how, because our cars have gotten bigger, the blind zone for the driver has also gotten bigger. So for a typical sedan, they use a Toyota Camry. The blind zone of a person driving sitting all the way in the back is about a little over 3 feet. But when you take it to a Cadillac Escalade, that blind zone extends all the way to 10 feet. So even beyond just the traffic related deaths that are happening in the roadway, we're seeing a significant increase of rollover accidents of children, usually in, a driveway by a family member, frankly, because they just can't see these kids because we are having bigger and bigger vehicles. And this is to really drive it home, is that larger vehicles are going to have these larger blind zones. So this is 12 little kids that are lined up. And that driver, if there's a person sitting in that driver's seat, they can see the 12th kid. They cannot see all those other kids in the middle. And so this is another reason why we are having a significant increase in pedestrian deaths, as well as cyclist deaths. And then when we look at race, this was prepared by Smart Growth America, the Coalition for the Complete Streets Coalition. It's called Dangerous by Design. And so it talks about the pedestrian deaths. And so when we look at race, we know that people, Black, African American, and Native American are overrepresented in pedestrian fatalities. And so I know you're wondering, well, how do we get there? So before that, so in chapter 4, I talk about power, influence, and the complexity of people. The thing about engineering, it's not really that hard. The thing about planning, I know Ben is probably going to disagree, but it's not really that hard. We know how wide the road is. We know what we are trying to accomplish in that roadway. What makes it challenging is people, because everyone has a different idea of how that road should be used. There are some people who want to be able to drive, and if they have to sit at a traffic light longer than need be, they are very upset, and they call their council member, they call their mayor, and they say there is traffic. And that is, one view of things. There are people who say, you know what, the reality is we've overbuilt this road. That means there's more capacity, and we should probably look at narrowing the roadway and using it for other modes of transportation. And those are the things that make it complex. So within my book, I talk about 4 key stakeholders: people in power. So those are your elected officials. Those are the people you vote for whenever your elections are. And that may be at a city level. It may be at a county level, a state level. Every community is different in terms of where the decision-making power is, especially for transportation. When I was at the city of Houston, most of that decision power landed at the actual city. So I had a lot of power within the position that I had at the city of Houston. The mayor, it's a strong mayor form of government. So the mayor has a lot of power. So that power structure is very important, because that is the person that is ultimately, or people that are making decisions about your life. They're making decisions on, whether a road is improved or whether it gets widened. So people in power are very critical. You have your champions and your naysayers. Those are the people that live in this advocacy world. Anytime we have a public meeting, I'm willing to bet, depending on the neighborhood, we can guess exactly who is going to show up. And I know they don't like to be grouped together, but they really are the same. They're the people who have time to follow these issues. They're people that have time to go to the stale elementary school gym where the public meeting is being held. And so they have a power and influence, and it will depend, again, on the politics, the project, how much they have. But then there are these people in the corner. I call them the silently suffering. They have very low influence and very low power. And it's not that they are not important people. I think that they are critically important people, but they don't have time to come to a meeting. Generally, this group, they are trying to survive day to day. And a clear example of silently suffering, when we look at the beginning of the pandemic and we look at our language around the pandemic, we talked about essential workers, and we praised the doctors and we praised the nurses. And that is absolutely, and they were on the front lines, and I will give them all the praise. The people that we didn't talk about were the janitorial staff who made sure the hospitals were clean. We didn't talk about the people at the grocery stores who were stocking the groceries, that those of us could get groceries delivered to our front door. And we shut down our public transportation systems and didn't care how these people got to work. And many, I know that even in New York City, many of them had to resort to Uber or Lyft in order to get to work. And so that's what I mean by silently suffering is we make our decisions and we never think about this group and we never center this group. And what I try to do in all of my work is think about this group. And some very key examples. This is a photo in Tucson of a project I worked on, a very wide street. And here you have this school bus delivering kids in the middle of this wide street. The speed limits on this road were about 45, 50 miles an hour, and they are going to widen this road. And there is a person, and that person is what I would consider the silently suffering. And all because the roads get a little bit congested during rush hour, nothing terrible, but there's this perception that people should not have to sit in traffic. And so we're just going to continue to widen the roads and widen the roads. When I talk about the silently suffering, this is from Houston. This is a community where it is an open ditch system and there are no sidewalks. And this person is in a wheelchair having to navigate their community with no sidewalks. This is unsafe. And the problem is, the challenge is, in Houston, there is a decision that sidewalks would be the abutting property owner's responsibility to install and maintain. And so that is a decision that has been made. And so people who have the means to be able to install the sidewalk do, and the people who don't end up in communities like this. And the bigger challenge is with the drainage, it makes it all the more expensive to install a sidewalk. And this is what I mean by silently suffering. This is a photo I took in Charleston, South Carolina. This person is walking to a bus stop. There are no sidewalks. So this is silently suffering, where we've put in transit and we have made no way for people to get there safely. When I talk about silently suffering, in the engineering world, in the planning world, we would call this a complete street. And it is because it accommodates all users. There is a nice wide sidewalk. There's a little bitty buffer. There are a lot of street available, and transit runs on this street. And so this is what would be considered a complete street. And I will tell you, if you see a street like this anywhere in America, I don't care what city in America, if you are on this street, you will probably die. This is the type of street where we have what we call our high injury network. And that is where people are dying or being seriously injured. And largely the reason is we put transit on this street and we make no way for people to get across. And human beings are always going to go the path of least resistance, and that is straight across. No one is going to walk out of their way 1.5 miles to get to a light to cross safely. No one is going to use a pedestrian bridge. If you build a pedestrian bridge, the American Society of Civil Engineers will put it on their bridge calendar and no one will use it. And this is because we haven't centered people and how people move and how people need to move. And so this is a photo from Montgomery County, Maryland, but you will see this road in many places. Oh, matter of fact, let's go to Charlottesville. So this is an intersection that borders the county and the city, an extremely wide road that surprisingly has sidewalks. And unfortunately, even as recent as a few weeks ago, a person lost their life on this street. There is no way to cross the street. I have Googled Earthed it, I have Zoomed it and everything. There is no way for anyone to get across Seminole Trail. And human nature is, I need to get across the street, particularly since the bus stops are across the street. And people see their bus and they will mad dash to the bus because we know that the next bus isn't coming for 30 minutes. And I need to pick up my child from daycare. I need to get to the doctor and make my appointment. All of these things. And so these are the type of roads that when we look at dangerous by design, they are dangerous by design. And even when we zoom in, there is no way to get across. There are a lot of lanes available. And this is very typical. There are plenty of roads like this in Houston. And these are typically the roads that, as I mentioned, on our high injury network. And so how did we get here? I'm going to do the very short history of transportation, and I'm going to talk about segregation, and we're going to get through it. And then Ben and I are going to have a really great discussion. So the American dream. So one of the first written descriptions of the American dream is in 1931, where it says, life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to their ability or achievement. So that is the first written definition that I was able to find for the American dream. If you Google, this is just a screenshot from my computer of Google, I did no manipulation. If you Google American Dream ads, what you will find are plenty of ads with white families. It'll be a husband and a wife, a little boy, a little girl, a family pet, either a dog or a cat, and they will either be in their automobile or they'll be in front of their house with their white picket fence. There is one photo that I was able to find that is a little bit different, and it's this photo taken in 1937. And it's an interesting juxtaposition of the American dream. So in the back is this advertisement that says, world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And there is the family that I previously mentioned sitting in their car. Even the dog is smiling because he's so happy to be in the car. And in the foreground, you see mostly Black people, but also people of other ethnicities. And I will talk a little bit about that in a minute, but this is what you see. And so when we talk about the American dream, it was for a very specific demographic of the United States. And so the short segregation history is in 1865 rather, we had the end of the Civil War. So now we go into the Reconstruction period. But 1896 is one of the key landmark Supreme Court of the United States decisions, and that's Homer Plessy versus Ferguson. And that is where Homer Plessy, who was, I believe he was an eighth Black, so one drop rule at the time, he was white presenting. However, he attempted to board a white only rail car, and it was told no. And so the Supreme Court had upheld separate but equal. In 1954, you have Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended segregation and ended separate but equal. But we all know that's not really what happened. Armed guards had to escort kids to school. But we have in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, and that, quote unquote, really ended segregation. But we also know that there was systemic segregation, even beyond that. And so this is a map of Houston. You will see these maps of different communities, and they're called redlining maps. And they were created to push investment in very specific ways. If you look at pretty much any city and you look at their redlining map, in the areas where you see desirable or most desirable are probably communities today that are mostly white and mostly high income. And that is true for this particular map. Most of the areas that were considered highly desirable are mostly white and extremely high income today. And these maps started around late 1800s into about 1930s or so is when you see these type of redlining maps and how investment was pushed. In addition, you had protective covenants and deed restrictions. And so what that was, it's putting things on literally deeds of property, say that you could not sell to certain types of people. So one of the things that's important, if you remember back to that photo of the food line where it did have some white people in the food line, you cannot look at history with a present day lens. Because today we would say someone who is Irish, someone who is Italian, we would call them white. However, there were protective covenants even back in 1931 that if you were Polish descent, if you were Irish descent, if you were Hungarian, if you were Jewish or colored, you could not live in certain communities. And those, and unfortunately, this language still exists on deeds. They're not legally enforceable, but it does still show up on deeds. And even in Charlottesville, you all had deeds and protective covenants that basically said no one in this subdivision, it shouldn't be sold to anyone who isn't white. And I'm willing to bet that many of these communities are still largely very white and it's still very segregated. And I say all this on the backdrop of the highway timeline. And I won't get too deep in this. I know we have a great conversation coming up. But the most important part about this timeline is the Federal Aid Act of 1956. So if you remember the segregation timeline, we are peak in the middle of trying to get to civil rights. We're not there yet. We're in the civil rights movement, but this is when many of our highways, many of our roadways were funded. And what we did was we tore down Black and brown communities in order to build the highways. And so this is a map that I share in my book. This is a 1960 map of East Baton Rouge. And this is a map that planners like Ben's predecessors, draw on a map. We do the little bubble map to say where we think something could happen. And so they drew a bubble map to show where Interstate 10 could go through Baton Rouge. And Interstate 10 today connects Florida to California. But there's a little parcel on this map right underneath that shaded area. And on the front part of that parcel, there was a house that was owned by my great grandmother. On the back part of the parcel was a house that was owned by my grandparents that my mother lived in most of her childhood. And this is a photo on the left provided by my mom of my great grandmother's house. As a child, I visited that house, which literally sat underneath the interstate. It was the only house that remained. All the rest of the houses on that block were torn down. Mostly it was a Black and Italian community, but all the rest of the houses were torn down. So I did visit my grandmother's house underneath the interstate. On the right is now what that looks like today. The house has been since torn down. And as you see this park, this attempt to reconnect a community that was divided by this highway, and the impacts of that today. And oftentimes, even in our best efforts to right these wrongs, we forget that these communities are gone. They've already moved away. They already have other lives. And the important part, even for me as an engineer and as a planner, it's the reminder that there are people alive today who remember what the community was before the highway. My mother is very much alive. Most days she's in her right mind. And she remembers all of this. And even my uncle shared a story of, cows falling off the highway at some point. But there are people alive who remember this. And that is a reminder to me. And this is just a Google Earth view to show what it is today. And the fact that they now call that lot of land Expressway Park as a way to reconnect the communities. But it doesn't actually really truly repair the harm that was done. And so with that, the call to action and the way forward. So in my book, I talk about, well, what can we do? And so I will focus on the top two, and that's number one is moving quicker, and number two is directing a vision. I know one of the things about transportation, it takes a long time to implement a transportation project. It can sometimes take decades and generations to implement a project, but there are ways to move a little bit quicker. So this is a project from Houston that we worked on at the intersection where people couldn't get across the street. So what we did, if we were to actually build what this is, we would probably be looking at about $200,000, if not more, because drainage is very sensitive in Houston. But this particular project where we just use pylons and we created what is called a bulb out. So it shortens the distance that people have to be in the street in order to get across the street. It makes it safer. This cost about $20,000 between labor, and that was in-house staff, did this on a weekend, and materials. And then they painted in everything. So this was a very low cost intersection. On the higher end, so this is another part of Houston. This is Hillcroft, where it looks very much like Seminole Trail, an extremely wide street in a community that is very, very dependent on public transportation, walking, and biking. It is very low car ownership. We actually call this community Little Ellis Island. It is a huge immigrant community. It's where people come in and they get their start in Houston, and then from there move to other parts of the city. And so with that, we actually reclaimed some of that roadway space where we were able to add in a protected bike lane, a concrete protected bike lane. We were able to add this beautiful piece of art in the middle and to make it safer for people to get across. And so this is about $4 million to implement, and we actually got it done pretty quickly. And so today the traffic isn't backing up. I know everyone thought it would be gloom and doom with traffic, but traffic is flowing better. People are safer as they're able to get across the street. And so this is what I mean by moving quicker. And then having a vision. I'm going to give you some things to think about, and it may not all work in Charlottesville, but at least it gives you the ability to dream and think big. So this is a photo from Amsterdam that I took. A lot of times when we think of Amsterdam, people think of biking. But from a transit perspective, that's all I did because I was so fascinated by I am a transportation nerd and I go on vacation and take photos of transportation. Yes. And it was so awesome to use this transportation system. I don't speak a lick of Dutch. I don't read Dutch. I don't know anything about the language, but I was able to navigate around this city very easily on their transportation system. Even on Tuesday at 11 o'clock at night, these trains were showing up about every 5 minutes. So I felt very safe. I didn't feel exposed sitting at a station waiting for the next train, particularly since I don't speak the language. So I really love the Netherlands for that. And I showed you earlier a complete street, the US way. This is a complete street in Amsterdam. And so we see a really, really, really wide sidewalk for people to walk. There is parking available for people who are still choosing to drive. There is space available for people to bike. And as you all know, Amsterdam is a huge biking culture. I think it's 2.5 bikes for every citizen. There is the public transportation in the middle, but there's still lanes available for people driving. And it was a really great experience to be able to move around. I'll take you down south, South America to Cali, Colombia. I know a lot of people talk about Bogota, but Cali was the city to go to. And what I love about Cali is they actually had bus only streets. So what they said is no vehicles could be on this street. It is going to be for buses only. And you have these beautiful buses. They showed up pretty frequently. And so I sat there for, yes, on my vacation and watched the buses come and go. But these are the things that we can do very easily when we can't afford to do trams because they are very expensive. And then this is Belgium, which is my favorite European city. And what's really nice about the entire downtown Belgium are there are no cars. It was so great to window shop and not have to hear cars. There's no exhaust. There's so many cafes along this area where you can just sit and people watch and drink a beer. The beer's really good in Belgium, and have some chocolate. The chocolate's really good in Belgium, and really just be. And so this is what I like. And so when I say have a bold vision, I think we as Americans have to have a better vision because we spend a lot of money to go to these places for vacation because we know how great they are. And so with that, I know that Ben has some thoughts to bring it local to Charlottesville and what's going on and how you all are going to move to the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. So, folks, if you have any, we're already getting some good questions coming to me in the chat. If you have any questions, Ben's going to speak for a little bit, and then I'll share some of these questions with Ben and Veronica. So thanks, Ben.
Sure. So I think I'll start with the second of your two big final points, which is having a vision and being able to move forward with it. I think the city does have more of a cohesive vision than we've had in the past. We at least are able to say what it is in our comprehensive plan in terms of the transportation chapter. But how that vision has been executed in the past has been sort of piecemeal and done by lots of different people. Before I was here, you had people do transportation planning in the transit department. You had people doing transportation planning in NDS. You had people doing transportation planning in public works. We're starting to unify that sort of in my office so that we're not doing things that are counterproductive. We would have some people who were trying to, make sure that cars were moving as frequently and as fluidly as possible, that were making some pretty big transportation decisions behind the scenes. And then there were other people who were trying to push really hard to get bike ped infrastructure in place. In a completely different silo, you have the transit department trying to struggle for funding, trying to struggle for places where they can put bus stop amenities. Now we have a little bit better way of communicating across departments in the city. We've had a lot of institutional turnover in the city, so we have opportunities to reset and come up with new processes that are more fair and more understandable for everybody who's involved. One of those processes that I walked into was, how do you build a sidewalk in the city of Charlottesville? Nobody could answer that for me for the first year that I worked here. We managed to build, I believe, one sidewalk during that time because the answer was, well, whenever we have an engineer who has some free time, we'll just plug them in. We're trying to get away with that with our upcoming sidewalk prioritization. We're trying to have a process that makes sense in terms of how is this thing going to get designed, who's going to take care of managing things like design, survey, doing grant applications if we've got to get more money. And then who's actually constructing it? Is that the job of NDS? Is that the job of Public Works? So we're working through some of those process questions so that we have a vision of how government is supposed to be working and taking care of these issues. In terms of transit, I'll speak specifically to the vision for that. We have a regional vision for transit that was put together by our regional transit partnership. That's a group that meets as part of the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission. It's electeds from the county and from the city, as well as our transit operators, CAT, Jaunt, UTS, and the school bus operators are at the table as well. They came up with a transit vision 2 years ago, published their transit vision. We are working at CAT to try to figure out how to turn that vision into a reality by pulling their vision concepts into our transit strategic plan. And at the same time, as the city, we're working with the county to figure out how we're going to stand up a regional transit authority so that once we have this authority stood up, we have a place where we can, as a region, make decisions about transit planning. And then as we get down the line, also make decisions about transit funding and potentially use that as a vehicle for making funding decision making. In terms of building stuff quick, that's actually sort of our focus here around the city, is figuring out how to do that right now. Our most successful transportation project in the past few years has been our Safe Routes to School program, which has taken federal funding from the ARPA and CARES Act funding and turned that into quick build projects that we can put on the ground. This was done partly out of necessity because we had a massive school bus driver shortage and expanded our what we call our parent responsibility zones, but we prefer to call them walk zones because we'd love for more kids to be walking. But we understand that it's not safe in every neighborhood for kids to be walking. So we've been rolling out these quick build projects across neighborhoods and they have schools in them. Last school year, we did about 80. This spring, we have about 100 quick build projects queued up. And they are getting put into the work order system for public service this week, actually. So we've got that rolling out. We also have a separate bucket of money for quick build projects that you'll find in our capital improvement program that's called neighborhood transportation improvements. It's a very boring name. It doesn't really tell you what it is, but that chunk of money is supposed to be for quick build improvements. The issue that I ran into with that is there's a need for so many quick build improvements. It was hard to sort out where to start. So we have been working with BPAC and we've tasked them to start pulling together, where do you guys want us to put the quick build improvements? Where are the best places where we have missing crosswalks? Where do we need bump outs? Where is there space right now for a bike lane that we could put in and wouldn't affect traffic at all, except provide protection for a bicyclist? I've commissioned our bike ped advisory committee to look into that and start pulling together ideas for those projects. We'll have sort of a back and forth of they submit projects to me. I tell them which ones I can move forward with and which ones are going to be an issue. While that's all going on, we're also moving forward with prioritizing our sidewalks. We're hoping to get that list out this month, at least the draft list for the public to be able to comment on. And then once we have that in place, we're looking to have a process flow in place so that we aren't worried about how long it's taking. We know how long it's going to take, and we're relatively satisfied with the quickness of it. So with those two, I think I'll leave it open for questions after that, Matthew.
Okay, great. I just was sent a picture of Charlottesville's latest sidewalk project that I just put in the chat.
Sidewalk number 2.
On Elliott, near where it intersects with Cherry / Ridge. If you're familiar, they're just up from Burnett Commons. There was a spot where the sidewalk stopped for about, how many feet was that, Ben? 75 feet, something like that?
I don't even think it was that far. If it was 50 feet,
yeah.
I would be surprised.
So they were out there the last few days. So things are actually happening, which is very exciting.
Yeah, we should have a purchase order out the door. If it didn't go out today, it'll go out tomorrow for design and survey for the next 4 that we'll be working on. So, awesome. Yep, things are moving.
So a question for both of you, and Veronica, I'll let you go first, and then and Ben, you take a crack at it for Charlottesville. So we're talking about big vision. We're also we're trying to think of and center the silently suffering. I guess, Veronica, how do we have big visions that capture the silently suffering? And then Ben, what are we doing here to have a vision that captures that group? So Veronica, I'll let you go first, because I think this is something that is really challenging, but ultimately the reason we should be doing this.
Right. Part of the big vision is, I think, if you take in, again, any city USA, and you show me the high injury network, it's likely going to be a Black or brown community. That is why Black and brown pedestrians are more likely to die. It is what it is. And so I will say, I think that if you talk about big vision, we really need to think about the physical public right of way, the space available to the public differently. What we do is my industry has designed the road for the few hours of the day that we have rush hour. And so depending on your community, it's probably, 7 to 9 in the morning. It's probably about 4 to 6 in the afternoon. And we've designed the entire transportation system for those hours. And what happens is, for the rest of the day, there is plenty capacity, and so people drive faster, and that's why we have a lot of crashes overnight. That is a lot of crashes during the day. And I think in terms of having a bold vision, it's how can we use that space differently, particularly when you have these wide roads. And so, yes, it means that some people may sit in a little bit more traffic, but we also know, I know that Charlottesville is around areas that may be more suburban, more rural, but even as an example of Ithaca, New York, where you have a lot of park and rides that bring people from the rural areas into downtown in the city of Ithaca. So it prevents people from having to drive. And that's why, honestly, even for me, living in this, rural city, I very rarely moved my car. So there are models out there. I know that there's even been models in California, particularly around kind of the more rural areas, that have on-demand transit that is really meeting the needs a little bit differently. And so I say all that to say we really don't need these wide roads, and we have to have a vision that says, well, what if we took Seminole Trail? And what if we got rid of half the pavement? I mean, think about the amount of trees that you could have. Think about the amount of development, just the developable space that you have. Think about the amount of, from a maintenance perspective, roads are very expensive to maintain. And I know this from my previous job, that's half the roads you have to maintain moving forward. And it just takes a level of boldness to get there. Even with, again, pick on Seminole Trail, just finding ways that people can get across the street safely, whether it is crosswalks or mid-block crossings or all of those things. And so I think that's how we can have, bold visions.
Yeah, so I can give you two different answers to the question. One is related to the Seminole Trail issue itself. We are partnered with the county right now on an application for a Reconnecting Communities grant for US 29. The county went after this last year. They were mostly focused on the part of US 29 that is in the county north of Hydraulic. This year they came to us and said, you've supported us in this last year, but we'd actually like to do this with you. Are there communities within the city that we can draw into this? And we've included the Meadows as well as the Mickey Drive residences over near Whole Foods in this latest application, which is really looking at what are the barriers keeping people in these communities along 29 from being able to reach the necessary resources that are along 29. Specifically, those people who are not in cars, because the cars themselves are becoming the barrier. More generally, so that's just specifically with 29, that's sort of the bold vision of where we're trying to go. Fingers crossed that USDOT gives us the grant this time. They said we did really well last year, but not quite there. They were more aimed at sort of highway projects last year and like taking down some of the highways that went through some of these communities of color back in the 50s and 60s. This time, we think we're going to have a better shot because we're looking at some communities that have been divided across the city county boundaries as well as US 29. So fingers crossed on that. More generally, though, and this speaks to probably my favorite part of Veronica's book, we are not really chasing the model anymore. We in the past have looked at transportation projects and said, how does this look when we put it through a model? Is it going to make congestion get worse? Do we need to design this up so that we can fit more cars through here? The answer basically at this point is we don't really care what the model says. We know we can't fit more cars here. We're running out of space. We're a little dot in the middle of a big sea of people who want to get to our really cool town. And we're just frankly running out of space. So when VDOT comes to us and says, hey, we need to build more entries into your town, we got to have more lanes on those roads for cars to get in. I get to be the guy saying, we can't really afford to do that anymore. We need to think through a different way of getting people to our town, whether it's transit, whether it's saying, maybe don't need to make this trip. Maybe transportation demand management, remote working is helping you live out in the counties, out in the rural areas and not need to come into town. Maybe it is carpooling. Maybe it is having park and rides. We need to look at those things, and that I don't think we have looked at as a region in a long time.
Great, thank you very much, both of you. So this is a question for Veronica. You showed some very beautiful crosswalks with lots of color. Could you share a little bit about some of the safety benefits of having a crosswalk that isn't just two white stripes? And also a little bit about potential objections or questions that engineers might have about whether or not those are allowed.
So for the non-engineers and non-planners, there's a book. It's called The Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And that is our Bible that tells us what things need to look like. So if you go to different communities, a stop sign is a stop sign is a stop sign. And the nerd community got very excited right before Christmas because a new version of the MUTCD became available. And that was the first time it had been updated in almost 14 years. So the new manual doesn't speak definitively around decorative crosswalks. It leaves space for engineering judgment, but it doesn't provide a shall or shall not or anything of that. So this particular, the intersections I showed, particularly the one at Hillcroft, that was actually funded by a grant from Bloomberg, Bloomberg Philanthropies. It's called Asphalt Art. And so with that, we actually have to collect a lot of data to see if things got safer, if people are just more respectful of crosswalks. So that's part of what the role of that is. What we have seen overall, particularly at that intersection, is people are slowing down, largely because it is no longer a raceway. We could probably take it down another lane, but I've already gotten run out of the city. I don't need to, I don't need to get run out anymore. But but part of that decorative crosswalk, it is, one, it's beautiful, but two, it actually signals to the brain like, hey, there's something here and I should probably slow down. One of the big challenges, it's the maintenance. And so when we went forward with the city, we actually had a maintenance agreement with organizations who will make sure that they keep it up, because the city does not have those type of resources to keep it up. And so there is a maintenance agreement on that particular art that's on the ground.
Ben, can you see any of these popping up in Charlottesville at some point, or has there been discussions of that?
Yeah, there's been some preliminary discussions about public art. There's been a little bit of discussions with traffic engineering about whether this is going to be a feasible thing at all. But MUTCD being updated kind of helped us with that side of the thing. The other issue within the city is basically since 2017, we've had sort of standing orders of no public art coming from the city government because we don't have a public art policy. And so for us to apply things in a fair and just way when we're talking about art and, the freedom of expression, we need to have a policy in place. And since 2017, we just haven't made one. So this year we are looking at doing that. Alexandria actually just approved one of their own, so we're sort of following in their footsteps, and we're looking at doing that probably starting this summer, I believe.
Great. I had not even thought, of course there needs to be a policy.
And I just want to add, so from the public art perspective, so we actually have a program here in Houston. It's called Mini Murals, and I'll drop a link for Matthew to share with everyone. And what we do is we actually make a lot of the transportation infrastructure available for art. So all of our traffic cabinets, some bridges, if there is an agreement for someone to maintain it. And we work with the arts community and on that. And so right now it's about 300 or so around the city, in each of the different communities. They're all mapped out with the community, the artists. So I'll drop that in the link, just as you guys are pondering public art in Charlottesville.
That's great. Yeah, there was a program called Art in Place that ended up with a bunch of statues and a few murals kind of throughout the city. I don't know that much has happened with that of late. Ben, in terms of slowing down cars in Charlottesville, what is being done about that? There's a few key roads. Fifth Street is where we've had numerous fatalities. There's been a little bit of work there, obviously not nearly enough. Could you comment on some things that maybe we would see in the shorter term to slow cars down and a little bit maybe longer term?
Sure. So shorter term, I can talk about Fifth Street specifically. VDOT is providing planning assistance for Fifth Street for us to look at a new alternative. I believe the last time we looked at something on Fifth Street was maybe the year before I came here. And the idea was we would shut down a lane in both directions, turn it into a transit and emergency services lane that bicyclists could also use. That had very severe traffic impacts, especially for traffic coming in to the city in the mornings. We had backups modeled that were from Cherry Avenue all the way down to I-64. So we're looking at a new alternative that would only close a lane in the southbound direction, and that lane would only be for a two-way cycle track. So instead of providing a bus lane or emergency services lane, we would be providing a protected bike facility there instead. We do have bike facilities on Fifth Street right now, but traffic's going 40, 45 miles an hour. It's not the most comfortable place to go. So we're hoping by providing that protected bike facility, we'll get some more bike usage out of that corridor. VDOT is going to be pulling together a demo project layout for us. So show us where we need to put the paint and plastic so that we can go out there and put it down quickly, test out whether it works. And then if it's a debacle, we can tear it up and see what else we can do with Fifth Street. In terms of other places that we could be going slower. Right now, the city's policy for dealing with traffic calming is kind of a reactive one. We have a traffic calming manual that says, if they're speeding on your street, you can ask the traffic engineer in the city to do a traffic study, but you'll have to get all your neighbors to sign on that you want the traffic study. And then once he does the traffic study, which may take a month or two, if he does find that there's a traffic problem, a speeding problem, he'll give you some solutions that he might be able to implement, and you and your neighbors can vote on them. But what ends up happening is we now have a big data source that we can look up how fast speed is on average on any street. And so he'll turn around from your email, look up how fast your street is, and if it's not above the posted speed limit, or even 10 miles over the posted speed limit, he's probably not going to recommend any traffic calming because that's within the variant that it says in the traffic calming manual. So something that we're going to need to look at doing is updating that traffic calming manual, but even deeper than that is updating our standards and design manual. This is a manual that comes out of our Streets That Work planning program that came up with design guidelines for our streets. those were turned into regulations and standards that our engineering department follows. And that also informs our traffic calming guide. The first page of our standards and design manual says this is going to be updated every year. It was last put together in 2018. It has not been updated every year. We've got a lot of things to go back and change in order to make our system less reactive. It's going to take a little bit of time to figure out what that process is going to look like, but that's the direction we're headed in.
Yeah, I know a few people that have done petitions to try to slow down their streets, and they have described it as you would describe the accomplishment of like getting a college degree. Like it was like the research they had to do to even figure out how to do it, and then literally going door to door. If they had a lot of renters on their street, they had to get the owner of the property. You know, very few people are going to do that. And
yeah,
you know, so
and the challenge is not actually whether people are speeding or not by the number, really.
Right.
The problem is people don't feel safe on their streets.
Right. Yeah.
And what we're telling them is, well, you're wrong. We looked at the number and you're safe. And that's just not really helpful for anyone. So we are going to be looking at how we are going to be approaching that whole system over the next year. I know that is definitely a problem that is baked into how things work here.
Ben, don't feel special. We deal with the same thing in Houston, and we have speed humped ourselves to death. And partly because the default speed limit is set by the state, and it's 30 miles an hour, which on a very narrow residential street, they're going 30 miles an hour, but it feels too fast because it is a very narrow residential street. So it's the same thing. You petition, get your people together. And then in our case, then you got to find someone to fund it because there's no funding in the program. So you got to go to the council members, see if they'll fund it. And it's just not the way to do it. We've been in a, kind of multi-year struggle to get the state to lower the default speed limit, because that's really just kind of the linchpin for a lot of this. It's just people are going 30. It's too fast on this particular road.
Yeah, and there's good news with that in Virginia. We can lower the speed limit here, partly because we're an independent city. We own our own roads. VDOT doesn't own these roads, but also we had a statewide default speed limit of you couldn't drop it below 25 miles an hour unless you were in a school zone. That was removed from independent cities back in 2021. I believe right now they're moving through the legislature with removing it from counties and towns as well. So we have some flexibility there. It's just a matter of figuring out where we want to make these changes and how we make them in a way that is scalable across the city.
Absolutely. And you at least have 30-something people that are probably in Charlottesville that can send a letter to their elected representative to encourage them to move forward with said bill.
Yeah. So along those lines, Veronica, one last question, then we'll kind of wrap up. What are some phrases or strategies you found effective for getting elected officials to shake out of their car-centric approach? Any tips on, our group tries to influence policy, which means we have to influence people. And what are some different angles, a few angles you found that have kind of been productive? Because I think you do such a nice job of explaining in the book, we can't be just beating people over the head with stuff. We have to find common ground. We have to convince people. Any thoughts or recommendations on that?
I will say it's very challenging for me. I always try to lead with safety and public safety, especially if it's a bike projects, like get people to a level of emotion that is just, and that doesn't matter what community, but to just focus on safety. And particularly the more you can personalize it. So it's not about a number, it's not about a number of people that died in the community, but to actually be able to specifically say a name and an age. To me, that has been very helpful. Even with the Houston's Vision Zero is for zero traffic-related deaths and serious injuries. And our plan actually lists the names of all the people that have died on the roadways of Houston. And so it humanizes it and it makes it personal. So that is one thing, is just focusing on the safety aspect. And then there's the economic aspect. There's enough data out there. When we can slow cars down, the economics of the businesses along that road improve. And I know that many organizations have been studying that and looking at that, and have been able to get that data source. So I think those are the two things, especially with elected officials. It's really about public safety, and it's really about the economics. The safer we make this road, the better the economics of all of these businesses.
Great, that's fantastic. I really appreciate that. So we're going to wrap up. We always kind of try to finish with some practical things that people can do. So if you're interested in this and want to get a little more involved in Charlottesville, certainly Livable CVille, we're trying to advocate. The Bike Pedestrian Advisory Committee, is it a committee, Ben? Is that what the C stands for?
It is a committee, yeah.
The committee. Is actually it's a well-functioning, practically oriented city committee. And I'm going to drop Guinevere Higgins' email in the chat if you want to get in touch with her. She's on it and she's awesome. And that's one way you can get involved. And another way, Ben, maybe you can share with us a little bit about what's in the works in terms of the sidewalk plans that are going to come out and how people can get involved and provide feedback on that.
Yeah, sure. So our sidewalk plans should be coming out at the end of the month. We're trying to put together sort of how you're going to submit comments on it. It's going to be a map that is going to be hosted on the city's website. The idea is that you'll be able to click on each project, get a description of what the project is, basically the extents of it, which side of the road it's supposed to be on, and which tier of difficulty we think it's going to be. We have things that are tier 1 that we think we should be able to knock these out quickly. And we have some things that are tier 3 that we think, we might need some more money. We might need some more coordination with partners. So we want folks to go through and provide comments on all of our projects and say, maybe this is going to be harder than you think it is. Maybe it should be on the other side of the road. Have you considered connecting it to this other piece that's over here? Or maybe this is a terrible spot for a sidewalk. I doubt there's going to be much of that, but we'll see. So keep an eye out for that. Towards the end of the month, we're going to be keeping the comments open for probably about 4 weeks, and then wrapping up the final edits and putting out the final list sometime in late May, early June is what the time frame is looking like right now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both very much. Thank you to everyone who attended, and we will stop there. I hope everyone has a nice evening.